Thank you. So I think I'm part of that, probably part of that rent-seeking coalition that Mark's just been talking about. So before I start, I thought I'd out myself as the person I am. I think Werner's gone, but I've been, unlike him, I've been a student of neoliberalism for 20 years now. Because my first paper was published with Jamie Peck, who'll be talking tomorrow afternoon, 19 years ago on neoliberalism, and we argued in that extremely prescient paper that neoliberalism was unstable, contradictory. It was a post-Keynesian experiment that just couldn't survive. So you should probably treat everything I say with the same degree of analytical scrutiny. We published a paper last year or the year before which revisited it, which said we were absolutely right analytically, but just wrong on that particular contingency, which I think bears reading at the very least. But having been a student of neoliberalism for so long, I'm now no longer really an academic. I'm probably more of a recovering academic. As Roger said, I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Knowledge Transfer at the University of Birmingham. I led for Universities UK on a recent campaign to exempt the research data that is held at universities from the Freedom of Information Act, because the current position is that all data held within universities that hasn't been fully funded by commercial companies, because that's covered by commercial exemption, is potentially discoverable by anybody from anywhere around the world if they put in an FOI request. So we made the case very strongly that was damaging to science. I have to say that we made the case it was damaging to our commercial relationships. But the biggest damage it would cause, it would, if people realise this, and it's been used once or twice by climate change deniers, but not much more than that. But if this became something that was realised, then what would happen is that there'd be a pressure to publish rapidly, which would lead to poor quality research rather than stronger deliberative research. And I mention that for two reasons. One of them is because I'll be able to repeat or to tell you the joke that Roger alluded to at the beginning. So if you didn't watch The Thick of It, which is a commentary about British politics, the final series started off with a couple of ministerial advisors talking, and the opening dialogue of the whole series goes, "Well, I'm saying Tickell. It'll undermine him and make him look stupid." And I actually was in Cabinet Office the week after, making the argument for exemption from Freedom of Information Act, and made that joke to Francis Maud, and they all thought it was very funny. So I kind of enjoyed that. So that's not really much of a reason for plugging, but other than to say I am deeply implicated in contemporary politics in the UK. I don't want to pretend that I'm not. And we have won that campaign. So the government signalled in the Queen's speech that universities will be exempted from FOI for our research data, and they're going to find legislation during the current Parliament to do that. But as a reward for that, there are two subsequent things I've done which I'm going to out myself on. The first of them is I was a member of the Finch Group on open access, and I'll come back to some of the things that John said that arose from that. And the second is I'm also a member of something called the Research Sector Transparency Board, which you will almost certainly not have heard of because it's not very transparent. But it's a quite a complicated body which exists within our sponsoring government department, and certainly the aim of some people on it is to open up all data in research universities, in universities as a whole. And there are others of us who are members of that group who have a very different set of interests. And so we've only met once. How it will play out, I don't know. But it's kind of an interesting thing that it is something that is of sufficient interest. And it speaks to the whole transparency agenda, which the coalition can agree on at a time when they can agree on very little else. So that's just, I don't want to pretend that I'm somebody I'm not, because those are the things that I do at the moment. I want to start by saying that I agree very much with both Mark and John that universities exist in a thoroughly neoliberalised environment. And my understanding of what neoliberalism means is very much one premised in political economy rather than Foucauldian, a Foucauldian approach to governmentality and neoliberalism. I see neoliberalism as much about politics and politics and ideology, and the politics and ideology of market rules as it is about market rules per se. I see it as a state project, both a project of the state and a project to capture elements within the state. And I see the state as being a contradictory organism. And I think that's where some of my differences with both John and Mark will come. I don't want to. I'm not going to repeat too many of the things that have already been said. But I'm going to put slightly different nuance in them, and I'm going to try to argue that there are things that we should feel quite positive about as well as feel thoroughly depressed about. The final throat-clearing remark I'm going to make, and I was asked to speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and I will try to do that, I promise you, so that we have a chance to have arguments, is that the environment this neoliberalised environment is one that seems to be more than just a local specificity and a short-term specificity. In other words, this isn't something that's a product of the last 3 years of coalition government in the UK, although clearly the sorts of things that we're seeing, for me, represent an acceleration and a deepening of trends that we've been seeing over the last 15 or 20 years in the UK, which means that it is more than just about coalition policy and the contradictions of coalition policy, if you like. And the second thing that I think really to emphasise is that there's a lot of geographic convergence around this in many university systems, and which is hardly surprising given the pressures that are faced in many countries around the world and the way those pressures are read and understood. So I was in Tokyo last week talking about the way that talking to Japanese universities about the way that the universities are subject to research performance management because the Japanese equivalent of our funding councils are thinking of a ref-type system. In Australia, they're doing something very similar. In New Zealand, it goes down to the level of an individual. So you will have an individual score as to your ref rather than a department-based score. And so we see there are all these sorts of things that we see happening are not simply short-term, and they're not simply confined to the UK, which is why I think we can think of them as being something which feels like a structural set of changes rather than, as I say, rather than something that's conjunctural. Having said that, I'm just going to rehearse and recap some of the main issues. I'm going to do this fairly briefly, not least because John has outlined them and in more detail and much more articulately than I can. I think there are some things that are really worth stressing, though. The first of them is around the issue of fees. Clearly, students who come to university in the UK now are paying a really significant amount of money for the privilege. There is a very significant issue for me around intergenerational justice, which is quite separate to some of the other things that we might talk about. I think clearly there's a shift there's a partial shift, if you like, in risk from the state to the individual. You take on a debt of £60,000, then you are, in very real sense, taking on a significant risk. I would mention in passing that we don't have Brown. We have a sort of a settlement which is actually probably, I think it's much less satisfactory than Brown, because Brown had mechanisms that would put in really significant taxes on universities that put high fees in place, and we don't have that now. So I think Brown actually would have depressed fees for students, but that's within the logic rather than without the logic, the comment I make there. But the system we have here is, in some respects, it's the worst of all possible worlds. So students pay more, the universities get marginally more, But if we allow for inflation, then actually by the end of next year or the year after, we will have less than we did before the fees regime came in, and we have an unsustainable system from the position of the UK taxpayer. So student fees are only work because this is an off-balance sheet debt in much the same way as private finance initiative is an off-balance sheet debt. And I tell you, you talk to anybody in any of the political parties and they know that this will have to be, the current system will have to be radically reshaped. And it may be after the election or it may be sometime fairly shortly after that. But this is an unsustainable debt that we're carrying. Interestingly, though, there has yet been relatively little effect on disadvantaged students, on students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think it's going to be a bit of time before we can really understand how it plays out. There has been a relatively small decline in the first year in terms of applications for social science and humanities subjects, but that seems to be picking up this year. So I think that understanding how fees will impact if they stay at £9,000 in the current form is actually quite difficult. And what happened after the introduction of the £3,000 fee a few years ago was a very similar sort of shaped curve, although the curve we're getting is much deeper now, in terms of the impact both on demand and in terms of disadvantaged students and in terms of subject mix. And I don't know whether that will change or whether it will just revert to the mean. The second big change really is marketisation. And there's the marketisation that John was talking about with the introduction of a very small number so far of private providers. BPP is owned by the company which has been implicated in all sorts of very dodgy practices in the United States. They keep on saying it's operated as an independent company. But the sorts of things that they got is they got a lot of money in student fees from students who never completed and never had a single chance of completing. And that's a very common pattern in private education in the US. So they draw down a lot of federal money, but actually the students are very unlikely ever to complete. We've also got the University of Law, which is obviously a very specialist provider of law degrees, and the rather unpopular to date College of the Humanities, which I think at last count had about 15 students. But who knows, they might turn out to be more popular. The bigger marketisation, though, is around the deregulation of places. And that's for me, that's a much bigger effect than student fees. And I'm sure you will know it, but students who get A, B, B or better can effectively choose which university they'd like to go to, with the exception of 5 or 6, which continue to be highly selective. Almost all other universities, I'm sure York is involved in that, are going hell for leather to recruit students at ABB, because we can take as many as we like, and we are highly restrained in the number of students we can take with qualifications below that. Now, last year, the effect of that was really damaging on lots of institutions. And the numbers are public or will be public fairly soon. And lots of universities saw a very significant cut in student intake, which was as a result of that deregulation of A-levels rather than and student numbers. Now, you can read that in two ways. One of it was extremely difficult for us as providers of education. For students who go to Bristol rather than Birmingham, then for them that's a good outcome until they get to the Bristol Library. Is there any from Bristol here today? Because if you try to get into the Bristol Arts and Social Sciences Library after 10 o'clock in the morning, you can't get a seat. And so there are pressures there. But I have to say, more students want to go to Bristol than want to go to Birmingham or Nottingham or York. And in lots of ways, this deregulation is something that they've embraced rather than not. And I think we just need to remember there is a flip side to something which is extremely unsettling for us. The third thing I just briefly mentioned is transparency. Claire gave a really interesting talk earlier about transparency in the US context. Transparency is really, really politically important in the UK, and it's really politically important for universities. The one thing I'd say that's the thing I would take issue with John about is around the form of open access that we face. So there's a strong rhetoric about gold open access, which is where we pay to publish, we pay the journals to publish our stuff straight away. That will never account for more than a trivial, or I think that will never account for more than a trivial percentage of the research that we do. So the form of open access that is going to be very dominant, I think, or completely dominant, is green open access, where we can publish after an embargo period, and that doesn't have the requirement to have the so-called CC BY license, which gives a full unrestricted use of on licenses. And I think that's an important difference, and it partly speaks to politics. So the research councils really wanted to push for gold open access, and they completely failed to do so because the pushback from universities and the pushback from the publishing industry was so great that the minister effectively instructed the research councils to change their policy, and the policy they've got now allows for a mixed model as we recommended in the Finch thing. Open data worries me more, and if there is a strong requirement to publish all our research data at a premature stage, then that does create really great difficulties, and I think it begins to disintermediate universities in a really significant way, in much the way that Michael Barber is promoting, actually. So universities become an empty shell where we give away our publications, we give away our data, we give away our content, our courses for free to a MOOC. And if we're left with that, we're left with some pretty expensive buildings to run, and we've got to have a really good reason for existing. And I think that is a risk for us. The fourth trend, again, both Mark and John mentioned this at length, is about commercialisation. This is really significant. It's significant for political reasons as well as for some financial reasons. Any significant capital investment going into universities now comes through is coming through a leveraged form. So the big UK RPIF scheme, which is science orientated, requires £2 of commercial funding to match £1 of public funding. And you can do that a bit, but in terms of creating a sustainable capital base for institutions, that is problematic. There is also, for some of the research councils, and notably EPSRC in engineering and physical sciences, there is a lot of industrial co-funding in the research that they do, particularly around doctoral students. And again, in lots of ways in engineering that works very well because students work in industry, and that's the sort of thing that the sorts of science they do, the sorts of engineering they do is actually co-determined. And I don't worry too much about that, but I do worry where it begins to shift the balance of what you do intellectually. And I think there are dangers of that which people are trying to push very hard on. There's also clearly a tension between equity and excellence, and there has always been a tension between equity and excellence in funding and in research funding. Dual support through the research councils and the funding councils has always promoted research funding excellence, but what's happening now is the curves are becoming steeper and steeper. So after the REE last time, we got funding for 2-star research. We now only get funding for 3-star and 4-star research. And the steepness of the curve between 3 and 4 is really high. So it's 1 unit of funding for 3-star research, 4 units of funding for 4-star research, and it could get higher after the ref. And that becomes really, really damaging in terms of the ecology of universities, I think, in the country as a whole. And then, of course, there are all the other noises off. UK Borders Agency is not friendly to universities, both through their actions and their rhetoric. And many UK universities have stayed solvent over the last 15 years as a result of international students. And that's particularly universities at the less research-intensive end. And I think that UKBA, particularly with their actions to London Met last year, were incredibly damaging to the health of institutions. And I think that's not a neoliberalisation thing, that's simply a UKIP and Daily Mail kind of thing. But they are very, very important. I mentioned just briefly in passing MOOCs. These are the massive open online courses where we put our content up for free. These may or may not be a transitory phenomenon. They may or may not be the democratisation of knowledge or the promotion of a hegemonic form of Western knowledge. They may or may not be financially sustainable because we're expected to give things away for free. Now, you might want to do that in your spare time, but your salary is paid for by either student fees or through research income. And there comes a point where if we give everything away, then we can't pay the salary bill. And I think that's a really significant issue. But behind MOOCs, there are for-profit companies. And I think we can sometimes get caught away by the rhetoric of these sorts of initiatives without realising that they may not necessarily be in the interests either of the consumers or the producers or us as producers. So in many respects, as I say, there's a lot to feel gloomy about. And I certainly don't wander around with a huge smile on my face and thinking that all's best for the best of all possible worlds. But I think there are some areas of disagreement. I think that the situation for universities here, as elsewhere, is more complex than trying to secure a privatised knowledge regime. I think there are strong currents in that direction, but I think there continue to be strong currents in the other direction too. So, for example, open access for research publications has the potential to be genuinely democratic. I think I find it very difficult to find a principled reason to say that publicly funded research in universities shouldn't be open and available to anybody who wants to read it. Now, there are all sorts of practical difficulties around it, and the form of licence is a really important practical issue, and the sustainability of journals is a really important practical issue. But I think I find it difficult to argue on principle. I'm not sure that I believe there was a golden age at any time. It was 1971 when E.P. Thompson left the University of Warwick and wrote Warwick University Limited to complain about the commercialisation of, I guess quite a few of you Warwick people here, of your institution, of that institution. It was the same year that Ivan Illich wrote Deschooling Society, and I think there are lots of resonances that we see through time. Again, when I went to university in the 1980s, only 10% of people went to university, and it's now 4 times that. There's much greater public engagement. Universities are more important for all sorts of reasons in British society, and I think we ought to encourage that. Maybe over the panel we can talk about the effect on humanities and social sciences, because Roger is desperately trying to get me to shut up. Very politely, I should say. I think with impact and the ref, we made a Faustian pact. And that pact goes, we will give Britain growth and we will give Britain improved public services as part of the deal for you giving us so much public money. Now, we only need to make one impact case study for every 10 people over a period of about 12 years. So actually, that's not a huge demand. And I think the other thing to say is that ref panels are constituted by people from within your subjects. And I don't believe a group of historians or political scientists or whatever they might be are going to turn around and say there is nothing of value to British society in history. And I think one of the things that really is noticeable is that universities are very good at playing a game, a very important game of selling the politics of universities to our funders. And our funders are government, and our funders are the specific funders. So I'm going to finish off, and I've got other points which I may come back to in the panel, or you may just ignore. But I just would say, I just argue that that we just need to have a politics which is slightly more nuanced than sees either the ref as audit, because I think the ref is audit, of course it's audit, but it's also an audit process which is captured by the subject communities who are being audited. And I think that we can make a broader political point. So if we compare ourselves to the police force in Britain at the moment, or local government, Police force have historically been loved by the media, but local government has not, and universities have not. If you read the Daily Mail about academics, then academics are not quite as bad as local government officers, but we sure as hell are better paid, and we contribute very little. But we have been relatively protected, not just over the last 3 years, but over the last 15 years, where more money over that period has gone into supporting us. And a lot of that has been about the way that universities have sold themselves as being of public utility in one form or another. So from this, then, I'd conclude that even during these highly neoliberal times, where we face phenomenal challenges, universities remain powerfully liberal spaces, and I didn't really make that point strongly enough, and that although there are strong strands of neoliberalism within the university, I don't think neoliberalism is dominant within universities, still less hegemonic. I'll stop.